Good evening, Missoula. My name is Mark Matthews, and we're here to talk about the first decade of smoke jumping. We have to go back a bit to 1910, and the wonderful exhibit back there will tell you all about the 1910 fires. 3 million acres burned in 3 days. After the fires went out, it stimulated a lot of interest in the Forest Service to develop new techniques to fight fire. So we started constructing lookouts by 1911. This is Mount Morale lookout over by Seeley Lake. They also started working on a trail system and roads so that they could get people to the fires quicker. Also in 1929, there were a lot of devastating fires in Region 1, and it got them going again, trying to come up with new techniques to fight fires. And in 1933, a fellow named Evan Kelly got an idea to bring all the mule teams of the region together into one remount station, and they started building the 9-mile remount depot. A lot of the CCC crews worked at the 9-mile. Civilian Conservation Corps. There were 2 Civilian Conservation Corps camps, Camp 9 Mile, about 3 miles from the ranger station, or the Remount Depot, and later they built Camp Menard, so it would be closer. If you've ever been up to the Grand Menard picnic area, that's where it was. It's about a mile from the depot. They also, the Forest Service bought some wintering ground over by Perma on the Flathead River. And if you've ever been over there, a lot of the buildings are still standing. I've read about it, written about it, and never went there. But when I did happen upon it a month ago or so, there's about 20 or so buildings still there, and it's owned by the Salish and Kootenai tribes now. 1925, the Forest Service started experimenting with airplanes. First, they set up an aerial detection program, parts of California, eastern Washington, Idaho, and western Montana. They experimented with dropping messages from the planes and taking aerial photographs. And in 1933, they started dropping cargo from airplanes. And by 1939, that was a routine exercise by the Forest Service. In the 1930s, they were experimenting with water and gas bombs to put out fires. The Johnson Flying Service dropped a few on Blue Mountain at one point. In 1938, the Forest Service purchased its first plane, a commercial type high-wing 5-seater Stinson aircraft. And in 1939, they abandoned the water bombing experiments. They just didn't have the technology to carry through. Meanwhile, this fella called T.V. Peason in 1934 came up with this idea that if we can drop cargo to the firefighters, maybe we could just drop the firefighters by parachute to the fires. And everybody in the administration and Forest Service had the same reaction. That is the most harebrained idea I've ever heard. But not everybody. A fellow named David Godwin in 1939, he was in charge of the water bombing experiments. He decided to can them and put the money into firefighter parachuters. Now, by World War I, it had become reasonably safe for a fellow to jump out of a plane with a parachute and reach the ground alive. 1939, not 1939, yeah, 1939, parachuters would hook up with the bomb-storming pilots, airplane pilots, and fly across the country, so that they're kind of known as daredevils. And that's one of the reasons why they didn't take to T.V. Peason's recommendation. They thought not only a harebrained idea, but these guys were crazy themselves. But Godwin picked up the torch, and they established the first bases at Winthrop, Washington, and Seeley Lake in 1939. They gave a contract to Eagle Parachute Company from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to provide the equipment and trainers. From October 5th to November 15th, 1939, they made the first jumps at Winthrop. And Frank Derry, a fellow named Frank Derry, was the head trainer. At first, they dropped 150-pound dummies attached to 28-foot condemned military silk canopies. And later, a handful of Forest Service guys made some live jumps, about 65 that fall. They used a 30-foot backpack and a 27-foot emergency chest pack. So the emergency chutes on the front, the regular chutes on the back. They wore two-piece padded felt suits, old football helmets, leather football helmets with a wire mesh mask to protect them from branches if they went through trees. Ankle braces, back abdominal braces, stout gloves, and heavy logger boots. And they proved that people jumping, parachuting down to forest areas could make it safely in altitudes ranging from 2,000 to 6,000 feet. 2,000 to 6,000 feet. The first fellow to jump into forest terrain rather than the practice fields was two guys, Glenn Smith and Francis Lufkin. So they proved it was feasible, and the next year they assembled a crew, two crews, one in Region 1 and one in Region 6. They ordered the contract for the planes to the Johnson Flying Service of Missoula. Johnson at that time had Travelairs and Ford Trimotors. Travelairs could carry two parachutists, the Trimotor 4. Region 1 opened up a base at Seeley Lake. There was no shortage of volunteers. Ages ranged from 21 to 35. There was a 190-pound maximum weight limit. And they were paid the grand total of $193 for the summer. For Region 1, these fellows joined up: Leonard Hamilton, James Alexander, Dick Lynch, Jim Waite, Rufus Robinson, Bill Bolin, and Earl Cooley. They constructed a parachute loft, putting two tents together on platforms, two wall tents. They also lived in tents that summer. And Earl Cooley described the first jump lesson this way. The instructor hung a parachute in a tree, called the crew together and said, "This is the apex, these are the risers, these are the secondary lines. And the colored lines are the guidelines. Tomorrow we're going to jump." That was the extent of our training. So they waited around for a fire call. The first one came in July 12th, 1940. A Travelair took off from Wilderness Landing Site at Moose Creek, Idaho at 3 p.m. with Earl Cooley and Rufus Robinson aboard. Merle Lundigan went along to kick out tools and supplies. And the fire was located at Martin Creek in the Nez Perce National Forest. There were strong winds that afternoon. Rufus Robinson, I think he was older or more experienced, but he pulled rank and decided to jump first. The winds dragged him over a couple of ridges. He drifted over a couple of ridges. He came down safely. He got on the radio. He said very enthusiastically, "Yeah, it's great sending Earl down, you know." And meanwhile, the plane's hitting some bad air pockets. And at one point, did I tell you they kind of retrofitted the airplanes a little bit. They took off the doors for the jumpers, and they put a step outside that they could kneel down and put one foot out and a handle outside the door. And there's a great shot in the slideshow.
We saw two of them.
Of a fellow crouching in the open doorway of the Trimotor, and you just couldn't jump out. You had to, it was really awkward with that heavy suit and all that equipment. So Merle Lundigan's standing by this open door, spotting, you know, looking down, see if Rufus is okay. Earl's getting ready to jump, and the plane hits a bad air pocket. Suddenly, Earl is up on the roof with his back against the roof, and Merle's flying by the other way. And fortunately, Merle doesn't fall out the door because he didn't have a parachute. It would have been okay for Earl to do that, but the plane stabilizes. They decide to jump anyway. So Earl gets out the door, and his chute only partially opens, and he's coming down fast. And he's looking. He starts to look down. No, well, first he's trying to get the chutes unraveled, or the lines unraveled, or something. And he looks down. You go, oh my God! But looking down releases the knot that got behind his neck, and the chute opens up just in time, and he lands safely. And I have some great photos. Actually, there's a photo of Earl, you know, posing with the parachute just at that time. And then I say, this is Earl before the jump. And then I took a picture of Earl about 2000, white-haired. And I said, this is Earl after the jump. So, if you can imagine that. Okay, so Earl had this to say about the first jump. If our spotter, Merle Lundigan, had not caught himself in the door, if my parachute had not fully opened as I neared the ground, there would have been 1 and probably 2 fatalities on this first fire jump. In all likelihood, the controversial idea of jumping men to remote fires would have been abandoned. But it wasn't abandoned. They took up the program again the next year in 1941 and transferred the project to Region 1. It expanded to 3 8-man squads, plus riggers, squad leaders, and administrators. And 26 men reported for training at Seeley Lake that year. Unfortunately for them, it rained a lot that year, so there wasn't much jumping. There was a flurry of lightning activity in late July, and the men were assigned to 9 fires. And the Forest Service estimated that they saved about $30,000, hitting the fires quickly and not having, with the Forest Service, not having to be forced to send in the mule teams and the firefighters. 1941, what happens in December? Pearl Harbor. We go to war. The Forest Service is ready to dismantle this firefighting experiment, the smoke jumping experiment. They do muster 4 squads of men in 1942, but by early September, most of those men had joined the service. At this point, a fellow named Phil Stanley comes into the picture. Phil was a member of the Quaker Church, one of 3 historic peace churches, Quakers, Brethren, and Mennonites. And trying to avoid stuff that happened in previous wars, especially World War I, the peace churches worked together with the government to set up an alternative work program for members of their church. And this was called the Civilian Public Service, or CPS. Phil Stanley was assigned to an old CCC camp in California. He got some firefighting experience. He heard about the smoke jumper program. He's like young guys nowadays. He was like really excited about it. And that sounds so adventurous and romantic. He wrote to the Forest Service saying, why don't you use conscientious objectors during the war as these smoke jumpers? And it may sound amazing today, but the Forest Service said, that's a good idea. So CPS Camp 143 became one of about 200, oh, I'm sorry. I lost my number. Maybe, yeah, well, I'm not gonna, there was hundreds of CPS camps across the country. And one of them became this smoke jumper camp. So the first camp was set up in 1943 at Seeley Lake. And 60 conscientious objectors trained that first summer. And the civilian director was Roy Wenger. Did any of you know Roy? Yeah. Hi, Paul. Roy died a few years ago. Earl Cooley. Many of you knew Earl. Earl was the director for the Forest Service, the government director, and Roy worked as the civilian director. And they had this consensus type of management where they would consult each other before they made plans and stuff like that. Okay, this is Rufus Robinson, Frank Derry, and Earl Cooley. Yeah. This Earl before the jump.
Okay.
And the next one is Earl after the jump.
60 years.
Okay, we're up to date.
All right. So where's that?
This is the COs that first year at Seeley Lake. 1960 60 guys. I'm not sure if they all made it for that photo. I guess I can. Well, this is Frank Derry doing a little training at Seeley Lake. So the next year, 1944, they moved to Camp Menard. And there's some training films that's practicing the landing. And it's a little arm workout. They have movies actually of these guys, and they would two hands jump from rung to rung like a monkey. They call these the tank traps. And practicing the let down rope. This was the tower. They would hook a rope to their harness and jump off this tower. And the guy said it was the worst snap than they ever got jumping with a parachute. The dreaded tower. It's from the top.
Guys that weighed 190 pounds dreaded it. At 135, I didn't care. But it was worse than the parachute. Had a big spring. And you would stretch that spring out and hit the end of it.
So about 250 men trained as smoke jumpers, 250 COs trained as smoke jumpers during the war. They were all Caucasian, young, fairly well educated. Quite a number of them were Mennonite farmers, so they were hard workers. Cooley said one of the Mennonite farmers could outwork a 10-man crew that he picked up off the street in Missoula. They also had a sense of self-deprecation. This fellow Tom Summers wrote a story. A fella came back from the paratroopers to train them, and one time Tom said, "Why do you guys yell Geronimo when you jump out of the plane?" He says, "I have no idea." So it got him thinking, we need our own yell. So he came up with this term, garde-loup. It's a French bastardization of the French language, garde de l'eau, which means look out for the water. And people in Scotland, the housewives used to yell it as they threw the slop water from the second floor into the street. So they started using this call a few times during training jumps. And years later, he explained why he chose it. Standing in my corral today, 1990, is a 6-year-old mule, foaled in 1987 from my wife's Morgan mare. And when the time came to name him, partly because of the sire's name, San Lou, the most natural thing in the world was to call him Gardy Lou. For what is more proletarian, misunderstood, rejected, and miscalculated than a mule, except perhaps in the public mind, conscientious objectors to the good war? So after the war, this is David Flaccus. He was a Quaker, and he's the fellow that started up the Mountain Press in Missoula.
Everybody hold their breath.
So after the war, some of the vets who had been the early smoke jumpers returned to their jobs. One of them was Fred Brower. Familiar with Fred? Fred argued against bringing any of the COs back because the government promised veterans jobs, to hire veterans. And there was also some potential of clashes between the two cultures. Fred said he didn't hold any grudges against the COs, but he did hold some grudges against the Forest Service guys who never enlisted, and he and Earl, batted heads whenever they came together. The veterans also brought a militaristic way of running things to the smoke jumpers. That consensus management thing went out the window, and the foreman would give orders and the guys would obey it. So there was a new culture came with the veterans too.
Fred had also been in the Battle of the Bulge. His perspective is
Right.
completely different.
Yeah, he flew supply missions to Bastogne. Was a decorated fellow. Skip Stratton said something about Fred. He said, what did he say? I got to get it right. Oh, he's not always right, but he's never in doubt. So in 1947, 1948, Region 1 trained 164 jumpers. 84%, or about 137 of those, were veterans. 40%, or 64 of them, were college students. And about half of them, 32, were working towards a forestry degree, many at the University of Montana. That year, Bob Johnson, are we waiting? You keep going. Bob Johnson purchased a C-47, which could carry 16 jumpers. And it was so big, he thought it took up the whole airport compared to his other planes. 1948 was a very rainy summer. Most of the jumpers worked on flood damage control projects. In 1949, this is still the COs. This was a wilderness camp. They set up a training camp and set up and this is Fred Brower. Hold off here. This Fred in the background. Can anybody identify the fellow with the helmet on? Yeah. This is the dedication of the smoke jumper base in Missoula. This is a C-47. It's an,
DC-3.
well, DC-3.
was a military designation.
Exactly. I jumped out of it 5 times. I don't know what that airplane is.
What was the number on the tail?
Good question.
Okay,
I
here's
went by it too
the
fast to remember.
this is the old Missoula Airport. What do they call it? Halefield. This L-shaped building is the fire cache. This is where I work now, at the College of Technology. Of course, they're not, the building's not,
That's
no,
the horse track, isn't it? Right
Yeah.
there, that fairground?
that's the fairgrounds.
Something in high school. Yeah, he'll be right where we're sitting.
So, we're up to date. 1949. This is Eldon Dieter. His backyard backed up to Earl Cooley's place. They used to talk across the fence. Eldon said, "When are you going to get me in the smoke jumper program?" Earl said, "When you turn 18." So he turned 18, 1949, must have been 1948. Earl got him a position with the smoke jumpers. And I thought this, this letter by Eldon, written on July 5th, 1949, gives you the character of the typical smoke jumper. And, okay. We've jumped 4 times now, and by the time this gets to you, we'll have 7. It's really fun after you get out of the plane, which is about the hardest part of it besides hitting the ground. I landed pretty hard on the first jump and pulled a few muscles in my leg and sprained my ankle a little, and so I have to have it taped every time we jump. I could hardly walk on it the next day, but it rained and no one jumped, so I didn't miss out on anything. I've jumped out of the tri-motor twice and the Traveler once, and today we all came down to Missoula and jumped from the C-47. It's really nice. The door is big enough so you can go out standing up. So it's just one long step. But in the other 2, you have to kneel down, a pretty good position, you can say your prayers, and put your foot out on the little step outside the plane. I came down so easy today that it was like jumping on a feather bed. The first jump wasn't so bad as I thought it would be. I was second out of the plane, so I didn't have time to get scared very much. No one has gotten hurt bad yet, only a few pulled muscles and sprains. About 10 injuries the first jump, 6 the second, and 1 the third, and 4 or 5 today, which isn't too bad considering about 60 guys jump each time. We get up at 4:45 and start work at 7 because the air is heavier early in the morning and there isn't as much wind. In the next letter dated July 20th, 1949, Eldon reported the next 3 jumps were pretty good. They're more fun each time. I hit in a tree on the last one, last 2, one about 3 inches from the ground and another about 4 feet. I think he's talking about his feet hanging from the ground, not the height of the tree. You don't even feel any shock when you hang up in a tree, but it really makes a lot of noise and tops of trees and branches go flying all over. We jumped on Blue Mountain, the one just west of Missoula, on the 7th jump. It's almost 10 o'clock, and I have to get up a little earlier than usual so I can go back to 9 Mile in time for work in the morning. So I'll have to quit now. All I can think to write about is jumping out of airplanes anyway. Love, Eldon. So on the afternoon of October 4th, 1949, they had a lightning strike. About in August. Oh, they had a lightning strike at a place called Man Gulch, which is just off the Missouri River, southeast of Helena. The fire smoldered through the night, and these are training photos from 1949, before Eldon was assigned to Man Gulch. And I think this was taken after the fire, but the gulch runs down into the Missouri River, and the fire started up here. The next day, about 12:15, Colorado Mountain Lookout called in a fire at Section 19, Township 13 North, Range 2 West. At 1 o'clock, I'm not even sure what's next here. Okay. At 1 o'clock, Canyon Ferry District Ranger Robert Jansen flew over the fire and estimated it to be about 15 acres in size. He radioed to the Missoula, the smoke jumper base, and requested 50 jumpers. Fred Barrow said, sorry, we only got one plane. We can only send you 16 men. And Jansen said, okay, we'll take whatever we can get. So 16 jumpers boarded the C-47 that day, and this is Robert J. Bennett of Paris, Tennessee. He was 22 years old. Being good-natured was his trademark. Upon graduating from E.W. Grove High School, he had bequeathed his art of always being a good sport to a friend in the junior class. The editor of the yearbook for the graduating class of 1945 had noted that Robert's favorite expression was, "Pardon me." This is Alden Dieter. He actually turned 19 on the day of the fire. He was having a birthday party at home when he got the call from the base to report. He had been born in Moscow, Idaho, where his dad taught botany at the university there. And Alden seemed headed in the same direction. He liked to keep field diaries and put a lot of drawings in his diaries of plants and wildlife. And yeah, I told you how he had bugged Earl for a job for years, and he finally got it. This is James Harrison. He was a smoke jumper in 1948, but his mother thought the job was too dangerous, and she begged him to quit, so he did. And instead he went to work for the Canyon Ferry Ranger District over by Helena as a camp guard at Meriwether Campground, which is in the drainage just south of Man Gulch, or south of Man Gulch. And the fellow second to the left is William Hellman. He was from Kalispell, Montana, 24.
Hellman's third from the left.
Hellman's third, thank you. Hellman's third from the left. I used to say, I think I said this one was Hellman, and Skip Stratton said, no, that's me.
Yeah, that's Skip.
That's Skip, okay. You have to get things right, you know, when you do history.
Well, especially when you got some of the history.
So if you notice in the background this landmark, the Washington Memorial, they had flown over to Washington to give a demonstration jump earlier that summer.
1948?
Was it 1948? Was it 1949? I
They
can't
jumped
remember.
in 49 on the oval.
Oh yeah, it'll be ellipse, yeah.
Took them 3 days to get there in the Ford.
Right. Yeah, there was one. There was one incident where they couldn't. Bob Johnson couldn't figure out where they were, so he took the plane down about 20 feet and flew past a depot, a railroad depot. And as they flew by, he said, "Did anybody catch the name on that depot?"
Sometimes they put them on the water towers too. Yeah. There's my boy, Phil McVeigh.
Phil McVeigh. Do you want to talk about Phil?
Super little guy.
22 at the time. He had been in the Navy. He had grown up in small towns along the Canadian border. His dad worked as a immigration and naturalization officer.
Bad Montana.
He loved to play baseball. This is David Navon. He was from Modesto, California. He was a little older than the other guys, 28 years old. He's a scholar and a seasoned traveler. He had been born in Argentina, where his dad represented International Harvester. And he had worked his way around the world in 1938, crewing on a Swedish freighter. After serving with the 82nd Airborne Division, David attended the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and he planned to become a range manager. This is Leonard Piper from Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He's 23 years old. He'd grown up in a small farm, and in high school he got interested in drama and participated in class plays. He was enrolled in the forestry school in Missoula and had planned to visit home for the first time in 2 years after the fire season ended. Stanley Reba was from Brooklyn, New York. He's 25 years old. He had attended Holy Cross College before the war on a football scholarship. He loved poetry and country western music. After the war, he enrolled in the forestry program at the University of Minnesota, where he met Julie Nagel, and they got married the fall of 1948. This is Marvin Sherman, 21 years old, from Missoula, Montana. While in high school, Marvin had worked as a lookout on Mormon Peak, just outside Lolo. He never seemed to have gotten used to parachuting. He confided to a friend one time that I nearly die every time I jump. Marvin had a girlfriend named Mary Ellen waiting back in Missoula for him. This is Joseph Sylvia from Plymouth, Massachusetts, 24 years old. He also attended the University of Minnesota, and he was Stan Reba's best friend. His nickname was Whitefish.
He didn't like to be called Little Joe.
No. Henry Thal Jr. was from Kalispell, Montana, 19 years old. His father was a retired Forest Service ranger. In high school, he had worked as a fire guard at Condon Ranger District. And in 1948, he had worked for the Forest Service here at Fort Missoula, where he helped the cook, mowed the lawns, and brushed off the pool tables. I wonder what they did with those pool tables. This is Newton Thompson. He was from Alhambra, California, and he was 23 years old. He had served with the U.S. Army Corps during the war and had spent the summer of 1948 as a smoke jumper. No one's been able to track down any of Newton's family members since people got interested in researching Man Gulch, so that's about all we know about him. This is Silas Thompson from Charlotte, North Carolina. He fell in love with the West after working as a fire spotter atop Copper Mountain Butte in Washington during the summer of 1946. To earn money for college, he enrolled in the Army the following September and spent 2 years with the 11th Airborne in Japan. Silas was also enrolled at the Forestry School in Missoula. Merle Stratton was from Worley, Idaho. And Merle actually didn't jump that day. He got airsick and flew back to Missoula with the C-47. And took his gear out of the locker room, walked up to Fred Brower, shook hands, and said, "That's all for me. I'm going home." And he didn't even hear of the tragedy until he got back to Idaho. And this next one is the fellow in civilian clothes. There is Wag Dodge, the foreman. He was 33 years old. Wag had been one of the pioneer smoke jumpers before the war. He was honorably discharged from the Coast Guard during the war, and he came back to help train the conscientious objectors. Wag was a married man and kept to himself for the most part, didn't have much interaction with the younger fellows in the crews. And this is Bob Salee and on the left and Walter Rumsey on the right, the two of the three survivors. Bob Salee was from Samuels, Idaho. He was 18 years old. He had actually lied about his age to get into the smoke jumpers. Yeah, when he was 17, he told Earl Cooley that he was 21, and Earl bought it. Walt Rumsey was from Garfield, Kansas. He was 21. He had been an Eagle Scout, had earned a pilot's license while in high school, and at 17 he joined the Navy. In 1948, he had worked on the Superior Ranger District. Okay, so this is a shot of the upper reach of Man Gulch. I believe the jumpers landed up around this flat area here. This neat. You get to see the. This is the gulch going down to the river, and you notice is some of these dog leg ridges coming down, cutting off the view of the river. This will give you an idea of how steep the slopes were. This is the south-facing slope, and it was capped by rim rock up here, which ranged from 3 feet high to 20 feet high. And as you can see, it's hard to tell the height of that from down below.
Did they ever try to seed that? Replant it, regrow?
I don't think so. I think it was just a natural regenerate. But during the fire, there's open grassy areas anyway. Further down in the gulch, it was very wooded. This is the mouth of the canyon where Ranger Jansen would come to scout the fire. Oh, shoot.
Let's go up.
I know. We got the map. Okay, so about after Jansen made his call, the jumpers got on a plane, flew over Helena, located the fire, and started to jump out of the plane about 3:10 p.m. And landing up here. About 5 o'clock, they had gathered all their equipment. It got scattered down the gulch. It took some while. They discovered that the radio had, the parachute hadn't opened, and the radio busted when it hit the ground. At about the same time, Bob Jansen had come out in a boat and started scouting up the fire. He didn't know that the jumpers had landed. He didn't know that Jim Harrison had hiked up here and started digging fire line. In fact, Harrison hiked up, started digging fire line, realized it was too big for him in the handle. He had run back down, tried to radio into Canyon Ferry. The radio's very fragile and expensive in those days, so Canyon Ferry only turned on the radio at certain times of the day. And Harrison wasn't able to get through. He wrote out a little note, "Be back, I've gone to fight fire, be back later," or something, and ran back up and started digging line again. So after they finish dinner, you can't fight fire on an empty stomach. Wag Dodge says, "I'm going to go up." Well, he didn't eat dinner. He said, "You guys eat dinner. I'm going to go up and scout the fire." So Dodge starts coming up, and about 20 minutes later, the crew starts following his path. Meanwhile, Dodge connects up with Harrison, and he doesn't like the look of things. There's a thick regrowth from a previous fire up there, and the wind's picking up, and he's kind of getting this sixth sense that things aren't going to go too well if we continue on this path. So he starts heading back down, and he meets up with the crew. About 5:40, they rejoin at this point. Meanwhile, at 5:30, Jansen's made his way up here, and he realizes that the fire has jumped over to the other side of the canyon. And he's almost caught in a fire whirl. He actually he goes unconscious for a while and wakes up just as the flames are creeping towards him, and makes his way back to the river and gets back in the boat and goes off for help. So Dodge rejoins the crew at 5:40. They cross the gulch over to the south-facing slope, and Dodge says, we're going to go down to the river and fight the fire from that end. This ridge coming down blocks his view, so he doesn't know that the fire has jumped. The wind's picking up. At 5:45, he stops. There's this big column of smoke coming up dead in front of him. He says, we can't go this way. The crew turns around, starts heading back up toward the jump site. You know, they're checking out the steep slope. Some of the men to go straight up. They see that rim rock, they don't know how big that is. It looks awfully steep there. The going's easier, just up gulch. So they continue that way. At 5:53, Dodge, oh gosh, I forget what he was suffering from. What was the disease he finally succumbed to?
Too eventually. What the heck was it? Can't think of it either.
Yeah. Some type of leukemia or something like that. Yeah. And he didn't know it at the time. So he realizes, I mean, by this time the fire is roaring behind them, jumping its crown, it's chasing them up the gulch. He realizes that he's not going to make it. And he does something that they weren't trained for right here. They've gotten out of the trees. It's all grass, open grass. He decides to light an escape fire, thinking that if it burns away enough grass, they'll be able to get in the black, lie down, and the fire will go around them, the main fire. He testified he had never heard of this before. It just came to him. Ironically, James Fenimore Cooper in The Prairie wrote about a similar situation on the prairie, a grass fire coming up behind him, and Natty Bumppo, you know, man on the spot, takes out his, I don't know if he had matches then, but he lit a fire. The fire burned out. They got in the black, put the buffalo robes over them, and the main fire went around them. So obviously somebody knew about him. But another curious fact is somebody asked Cooper about that scene, and he couldn't even remember writing it. You know, this was years later. So Cooper might have just been sitting at his desk, imagining this and thinking logically, oh yeah, if you light a fire in front, you can get in. So that might have been what went through Dodge's mind at the time. He realized the situation and he saw a way out of it. Dodge is yelling to the crew, come on, we're going to get into this black area. The crew can't hear him. They're all scattered around. They don't know what he's saying. So that they begin to take off individually. Most of the guys still heading in this direction. You can see where most of them, the fire caught up with them. And Salee, Rumsey, and Bill Hellman take off directly up that steep slope towards the cap rock, rim rock. Salee and Rumsey on the right hand of the fire, of the escape fire that Dodge lit. Hellman's on the left-hand side. When Salee and Rumsey get to the rim rock, they find an opening to go through, and they get on top, and they've escaped the fire. Hellman can't find a way through the rim rock, and he falls into a crack, and he's burned quite badly. Salee and Rumsey, I think we're going to drop down the other side. Oh, no, that's not ready yet. Into a place that that would be called Rescue Gulch. And from the rim rock, they can see the river clearly. And they drop into Rescue Gulch and find a scree slope. And there's enough places without vegetation there that they can escape the fire when it comes down into Rescue Gulch. Hellman survives the fire and makes his way over the ridge, and right about here, he might be calling out, and Celine Rumsey hook up with him right here. Okay, now where are we now?
Didn't Dieter follow those two, but then did go through the crevice?
Dieter, I forgot Dieter, thank you. Dieter was with Celine Rumsey too. When they came to the crack in the wall, he decided to veer off to the right and run along the wall, and he got struck down too. Thank you. So Dodge set his fire about 5:53. At 6 o'clock, Jansen went across the river, got up to a little height of land, and witnessed the blow up the canyon. At 6:10, the main fire sweeps around Dodge, lifts him off the ground a couple of times, the heat waves. But he gets up at 6:10, and not a, what do you call it when the cinders land on your clothes?
Blister.
Not a blister, thank you. He thinks, well, you know, other people probably survived too. He gives out a holler. Joe Sylvia survived. And Joe fell behind a rock. Which was enough to deflect the heat so that the heat didn't kill him right then, but he was badly injured too. So we're waiting for Joe's rock, I think. Oh, there it is. So this is the rock where Joe fell.
Yeah, he was sitting on that when Dodge found him.
Mm-hmm. He's looking down at it. So this is looking down in Rescue Gulch, and I believe that's where they hooked up with Hellman. So Dodge attends to Sylvia as much as he can. He leaves him a canteen of water. Unfortunately, he doesn't take off the cap for him. Joe's hands are so burned that he can't get the cap off, so all night long he's just holding that canteen of water and can't drink it. Dodge meets Salee at the top of the ridge, who is going to get water from the jump site. And they go back together and hook up with Rumsey and Hellman. They decided to leave Rumsey with Hellman, and Salee and Dodge head down the gulch. The fire has died down now, down there, and they're going to go get help. They get to the river. They didn't have a map. They don't know which way to go. And I'm trying to figure out which way the river goes. Oh, that way. Okay. They decide to go downstream. They run into a wall that comes down to the river. They can't get past it. And they hear some noise out on the river. And they didn't know that a lot of people from Hellman had gotten into their boats to come up to view the fire. They give out a yell. Somebody's out there in a boat, comes, picks them up, takes them to Merriweather Campground, where Jansen has assembled a crew to help fight the fire. They return to Rescue Gulch with Dodge, the rescue crew, Jansen and the rescue crew. They realized that the doctors they had gotten had forgotten to bring, what do you call them?
Stretchers.
Stretchers, thank you. Speed goes back to the landing, gets stretchers, and yeah, so at 8:50, Dodge and Salee arrive at Meriwether Campground. And I forgot to put the time, I think it was about 11 o'clock or after 11 o'clock that they're finally ready to go up to help the survivors, the 2 injured survivors. So I'd like to read you a little bit from the book to give you, if you could just imagine that night and what the rescue crew went through and did. So, okay, finally about 11:30, the drone of a speedboat bounced off the canyon walls. Would you like me to stand up front, or? As soon as the craft landed, the rescuers took up the litters and plasma and gathered around Jansen. "Be cautious, men," Jansen told them. "Stay together in single file and keep your eyes open." The small fires scattered across the slope created an illusion that an army of men with their cook fires was bivouacking on the hillside. But nothing stirred in the quiet night as the rescue team angled up the slope, with Bob Salee leading the way. At one point, the trunk of a dead tree blew to pieces when its resin became so hot it passed the point of ignition. Overhead, where the smoke-thinned bright stars shined in a tranquil sky, a slight aura of orange glowed over the ridge to the east where the head of the fire had slowed for the night. The men continuously flashed their headlamps to the slope above, searching for burned-out snags or dislodged boulders and logs. As he emerged from behind a line of big rocks, 2/3 of the way up the hill, Bob Salee heard a shout. Soon his friend, Walt Rumsey, was standing in the light of his headlamp. "What are you doing down here, Walt?" Bob asked. "Is Hellman all right?" "Yeah, I guess," Walt said. "He just drove me nuts asking for water all the time. He threatened to walk down to the river himself if I didn't come down and get him something to drink. I sure am glad to see you guys." Jansen recognized Rumsey from a former work detail and fell in behind him as they continued up the hillside. "Any sign of Jim Harrison up there?" he asked. "No," Rumsey said. "I don't think he got through. He looked pretty beat last time I saw him, having done all that hiking and digging all day. But you know, we all could have made it if we'd only followed Wag. The only reason I made it was that the Lord was good to me. He put wings on my feet, and I ran like hell." Rumsey, Salee, and Jansen pushed ahead of the main party with a water canteen. They heard Hellman hollering about a half mile away. They reached him about 12:35 on the morning of August 6th. The district ranger bit his tongue as the beam of his flashlight brushed across the firefighter's face. Flesh had slowed off Hellman's hands and face. Even though the smell of burned flesh almost overwhelmed him, Jansen moved to Hellman's side and steadied a canteen at his mouth. But rather than feeling refreshed, Bill Hellman clutched his stomach after taking a sip and bent over in pain. "Are you a doctor?" Bill gasped. "No, they're right behind us," Jansen told him. "I think I need a doctor," Bill said. "I think I'm in pretty bad shape." When the doctors arrived about 15 minutes later, they administered a shot of morphine to Hellman and set the intravenous tubes to administer plasma. They decided to leave his charred clothing where it stuck to his skin and spread a thick salve over the exposed areas. Through it all, Bill Hellman never complained. Some of the men standing in the shadows began to weep. At 1:20, Jansen instructed Salee and Don Ruse to accompany him over the ridge into Man Gulch to locate the other injured man. They hoped to find Joe Sylvia by the time the doctors finished with Hellman to avoid any further delay in his treatment. So about 5,000 men ended up fighting that fire, which spread to about 5,000 acres. And much as 1910 fires had stimulated the Forest Service into looking into modernizing their firefighting techniques, Man Gulch did the same. Shortly after, they started working on fire shelters for the men. They also came up with some safety programs, one of which was called 32 watch-out situations and the 10 standard fire orders. And I should have Paul come up here and talk about the LCs, LCES. Paul was instrumental in realizing that, gosh, it's kind of hard to remember 32 things at one time and 10 other things. And so Paul and some other people came up with LCs, which stands for Lookouts, Communication, Escape Routes, and Safety Zones. So if you think about Man Gulch, and if they had been able to follow LCES, the first thing they would have done was to put a lookout on that south-facing ridge. And communications, well, you know, they had this big radio, but it was only for calling out to the bases. So what good would it have done them anyway, even if it hadn't broken? But a lot of these fellows were in the service. They probably had learned to signal with mirrors, using sunlight, or flags. They could have communicated in that respect. And also they would have decided on the best escape route before they even approached the fire. And like Sully and Rumsey stumbled upon, they would have identified the safety zone where they could all have met up to. So if LCs had been in operation then, we might never have had the Man Gulch fire, and I probably wouldn't be standing here speaking to you tonight, which would have been okay for me. Not that I haven't enjoyed it. So that kind of concludes the first 10 years of smoke jumping, and thank you for coming. And you have a question?
I just want to say I was working in procurement down in the region at this time. Yeah.
Did you know many of those guys?
I didn't know many of the jumpers, just the names, but Lloyd Knoll was the procurement officer, and he was in charge of the remount.
Oh.
And yeah, very interesting times.
One of the big problems with those guys going up to the Rim Rock, I did that in '99 at the commemoration. And at my age, I could just barely make it. Rumsey and Sally ran up it.
Yeah.
I went up by crawling. Now, a lot of those guys weren't in good condition. Stan Reba was big, but he broke his leg falling down, running up the side hill. And that's why Joe Sylvia stayed with him. But they were in lousy condition. They weren't in condition like they are today. They showed a movie, our picture on the History Channel within the last week, I think. And the training that they go through now is 10 times what it was in those days. When we used to do our runs, I'd run backwards. I was running the mile for the university. And I'd run backwards in loggers and outrun all the guys. Stan Reba couldn't run from here to where my car is. It's no wonder he couldn't get away. Now the little guys like Henry Thole and Phil McVeigh, I traced their route, and they went a long, long ways before that fire got them. But they were running like a rabbit down the road. They were running right ahead of the fire, and it was moving faster than they were. If they'd gone sideways, one way or the other. I never could understand why Wag Dodge would lead them down to the river, right into that fire, but then when I walked it, I saw that big dog leg, and when the fire jumped, you pointed out where the fire was from where they jumped. And the way I was told when I was there, the fire struck, the lightning came up on top of Meriwether. And that's where Harrison was fighting the fire. Then when he walked down to join up with Wag Dodge was when the fire blew up. Embers went from Meriwether down into the mouth of Man Gulch, and the fire blew up with that terrible windstorm.
Yeah, there's another there. There might have been a sleeper down there too in the mouth of the gulch.
Yeah. But those guys weren't in any shape to outrun a fire. I know if I'd been there, I would have done the same thing, because I thought I could outrun it. Yeah, right. I'd be dead too.
Difference in the equipment. I first fought fire in Maine in 1947. We didn't have any radios. We had no communication of any sort and had no training.
Those are really spread out too.
47 in October.
It wasn't until the late 60s we started having regular
Yeah.
radio, and they were pretty bulky.
Maine was
One of the
under, the whole state was under martial law as a result of the fires in October of 47.
One of the things you always had to remember too, you called for a chainsaw, there weren't any when I was in the Forest Service, you called for a radio, whatever you called for, how do you think that's going to get back to the jump base? You're going to carry it back. So we had great big long saws. You could roll that thing up and walk away with it. Chainsaw, man, that weighs a lot by the time you carry it 15, 16 miles. Now there's a mistake in this picture. Everybody I've talked to says that lead guy is Wag Dodge. Wag Dodge was shorter than me. That's Bob Sally, who was about 6'2".
Who else
It's funny,
is in there?
Skip Stratton told me it was him.
Who else is in the photo? Do you know? Does anybody know?
Oh, I don't know.
No. Trouble is, they got their backs to you.
But this is the funny thing about history. Skip told me that Wag wasn't even there that day,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Earl told me that he couldn't keep him away. So,
Bob Sally is still alive, he's 78 or 79, he'll be speaking at the end of this month in Spokane.
oh,
And he'll be essentially going through remembrance. And one of the other speakers at this is the Inland Empire U.S. American Forestry Association meeting that's being held in Spokane. One of the other speakers is Richard Rothamel, who spent years trying to explain to Norman McLean why that fire did outrace the humans trying to go up that slope. And Norman McLean could not really grasp the mathematical models, being a professor of English, and he preferred to accept the oral testimony of Rumsey and Sally over what the mathematical models. And then the other thing was that Wag Dodge, as you pointed out, didn't have much communication with that crew.
He hadn't worked with them
Yeah, they
before.
don't know each other.
And the reason I say that is when he said, come into the fire, whether they all heard it or not, even those that heard him say it, said, hell no, we're getting the hell out of here. Part of this is the esprit de corps. They had no reason to believe that Wag Dodge knew what the hell he was doing. In fact, he was lighting a fire that the father, one of the jumpers, thought that it was the escape fire that killed his son.
yeah, Henry
So
Tall.
you could have a lecture that goes on for another 3 hours that goes into all the different aspects of this. And then Norman McLean's son, John McLean, has been researching not only the Man Gulch fire, but some of the within the last decade or so in Colorado, Kings Canyon or whatever it was,
Yeah,
mountain.
Don Mackey.
yeah.
Yeah.
Storm King,
Yeah,
Storm
well-
King Mountain.
Well, I'm an English teacher too, so as soon as I saw the mathematics, I said, I believe you.
But the incident did repeat itself, and now we do have aluminum shelters. I think there's a first edition now, there's a second edition of these escape aluminum. And I think this kind of a fire they could have escaped if that technology had. But you can say that this fire actually triggered that kind of research in the technological development section of the Forest Service.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.